Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database. And one of the things that I like about this project, which in a lot of ways, this is a horribly depressing project to be involved in every day, but something that does bring me some happiness and satisfaction is when I get emails through the Contact Us forum. And a lot of these emails are from students, sometimes high school students, sometimes undergrad, but also graduate students as well. And they're saying that they are interested in researching this topic. They would like more information about it, and they would like to brainstorm with me and just kind of talk about the issues, talk about ideas. And so the guest today, the soon-to-be Dr. Shay Swagger, is a PhD student in the School of Education at University of Colorado, Denver. And he reached out to me, just a cold email, and said, I'm really interested in this topic. I've looked at all your research. Can we just brainstorm about ideas? And we did that. We had a great conversation. And as we're talking, I found out that Shay grew up in Littleton, Colorado. And he was at Euclid Middle School as a seventh grader, about 10 minutes away from Columbine when the attack happened. And that went from a conversation where Shay was looking to me for guidance about how to research this topic into me wanting to know what his experience was in that community. So I want to take that conversation, and Shay is here today to talk all about what it was like before, during, and after Columbine being a member of that community. So welcome, Shay.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited. Thank you.
So let's transport back in time. I mean, Columbine was 20 years ago. It's hard to believe that it was that long ago, because for me, it still feels like I can remember that day. But let's go a little further than that day. What was it like in Littleton, Colorado, growing up in that community in the 1990s?
I loved it. I still live in Littleton. I call this is home for me when I think about where I'm from. Littleton is very much my community. So I remember being a 12-year-old kid and having a bike and riding around the neighborhood and having friends and having, a certain level of autonomy and independence, and in a way that I think a lot of millennial parents probably don't have for their kids. And I mean, it was the 90s. The 90s are great. It's my favorite. And there was this field by my house that we would play around, and had dogs, and just it was a really fun childhood. I had a great childhood. And Littleton, I mean, it's still pretty white, but back then it was more white than every other ethnicity. But in terms of class, it was roughly middle to lower class. I grew up relatively poor. But
so it was a homogenous American community of the 90s.
Absolutely. So any sort of pop cultural reference from the 90s that showed a white boy, that was me. I lived that experience. And I really liked my middle school a lot. Euclid, I remember I had moved a lot as a kid, and that was sort of the first place that I had settled down and felt like I was going to stay there for a while, which I did. I had good teachers. I had joined the choir. I was a huge choir nerd, and I had a group of friends that I really liked. So it was a lovely, wonderful place to go. I know a lot of people hate middle school. I get it. It's a rough time. I was kind of a weird kid that didn't get a lot of social cues. So I thought middle school was great. I missed any of the bullying that might have happened that I was just not aware of. But it was a really good experience for me.
Now, being a middle school student in 1998, did you have any recollection or experience of the attack in Jonesboro, Arkansas?
No.
That happened the year before Columbine?
Not even on my radar. Hadn't heard about it. Wasn't connected to national news in any sense. I was in love with Ariel Romero, who was in my class, and that was kind of my world. So another state somewhere else was not existent for me.
And I think I have that same lack of memory of the other pieces. But I think whenever we discuss Columbine, it's important to put it in the context that there was a very serious, deliberate, planned attack that happened
Mhm.
at a school in Arkansas the year before. That there had been significant planned attacks at schools every single year back to the 1960s. And that Columbine, rather than being the start of a problem, was actually kind of the center of an arc and a time when it really came into being something that every American thought of as an issue. But this was not the first attack. So let's get to then. There's this day where you're a seventh grader in April 1999 and you're at Euclid Middle School. I think that this day for you is probably what 9/11 was like for a lot of us. Can you kind of talk me through what it was like that day as a middle school student?
Yeah, for sure. So the day was actually over. Like our school day ended around like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and they didn't communicate anything to students, and there wasn't a lot of like actual facts to share by the time that we were done with school. And so I took the bus home, and we all lined up outside of the school to, join our bus that was pulling up. And I remember the first thing that cued me into something being different is there were helicopters that were just flying overhead. And I'm a kid, and I'm like, helicopters are the coolest thing. So like, this is great. There's so many. And then at some point I was like, why is there like six and now seven and now eight? And after like 10, like we were counting collectively as like a crowd of kids, trying to figure out what's going on because they're all going the same direction. Um,
And we've
and-
got to like reframe because I mean 1999 was actually kind of a long time ago. No, nobody had a cell phone.
nope.
Text
Absolutely.
messaging didn't exist yet.
Nope.
There's you might have had an AIM, away message,
Yeah.
but social media didn't exist. There wasn't anywhere to get information. So
No.
how did you start putting information together as a seventh grader?
So when I got home, um, my mom had the TV on, and my sister had got home from high school. She's a little bit older than me. And my mom's like, something's happening at a high school nearby. And so we turn the TV on and start watching news reports. And I see the perspective on the news of all the helicopters that I had just seen fly overhead. So it's all looking down, and there's police cars everywhere. I know that there's some sort of shooting of some kind or explosions. I can't remember exactly what information was made public like immediately the day of. Um, Very vividly, I remember people falling out of the window of the back library. Um, and I have no context. I'd never seen violence like this. Like I'd seen action movies, I'd seen, sort of pretend theatrical violence. I'd never seen real violence. And it was very local. It was in my community. Like I knew where the school was. I
Had you ever been to Columbine? Have you been there for like a sports event or anything?
No, there's a Barnes and Noble that's like right around the same park. So it's like Columbine, Clement Park, and then a bunch of stores. And, my family and I would go to that Barnes and Noble a lot. So like I've been in the area for, several years, like pretty consistently. So the news camera shots from like up top, I'm like, oh, I know. Yeah, that's my Barnes and Noble. That's the lake. That's the road that we drive on. So I remember sitting on the couch and watching this, and lots of feelings, anxiety, fear, a lot of unknown, and just this constant speculation of newscasters trying to figure out what to say because they don't have very much information. So everyone's speculating.
And there was no script at the time
Mm-mm.
for the 24-hour news coverage.
Yeah,
Columbine was different in that it was the first school shooting that had the national news coverage in real time.
correct. So I also remember at some point like recognizing the loop of the same information without any update. I'm like, oh, they don't know. And I remember feeling worse because they didn't know. Like I had this perspective that at least news was authoritative and that they had all the information and could help. And when I realized that they didn't, I was like, oh, this is not helpful anymore. And I just feel scared. And I think my mom at some point is like, we're gonna turn the TV off at this point and walk away and just kind of have dinner and go about like the rest of the day.
Do you remember what it was like sitting at dinner that night?
I don't actually. I can't remember.
I ask because I
Yeah.
think back to 9/11, and
Hmm.
granted, we were each a little bit older at 9/11,
Hmm.
but I remember that same thing of turning the TV off, sitting down, but nobody really having anything to say. That we
Hmm.
all just kind of sat in shell shock around the table that night, not really knowing what was going to happen next or what tomorrow was going to bring.
I remember getting phone calls on our landline that we had because people around the country, if we knew anyone that was out of state, they hear Littleton, Colorado. They know that like my sister and I are around that same age. And so people are calling us from California or Texas or family members in other states. And they're like, are you alive? Like, are you okay? I heard or saw this thing. And so I remember like my dad or my mom usually fielding those phone calls that happened that night and the following days of people checking in just to see that like was it our school, were we all right, which I appreciated. But it was also kind of like, so you are seeing this too. This is, we don't speak, you're my grandma that I don't know, and now you're calling, which was a new phenomenon for me.
Did you have school the next day?
No. And I also remember whether or not we were going to have school. My mom's like, "You're going to stay home tomorrow." Like that's, I mean, she didn't work. She was able to watch us and take care of us if we needed to stay home. And so she had already said, "You're not going," but also like the later the school communicated that they were not going to have classes. I don't remember how long we didn't have classes. It was at least a few days.
So then, it's 1999. You don't have, your own cell phone, obviously. Maybe you were on AOL. Like, what were your discussions with your friends like right in that moment?
We started discussing like at the first day back, our teachers actually gave us some space to have open discussion, which I really appreciated. And it felt like a more amplified version of when I realized that news anchors didn't have more information. I realized that my teachers didn't have more information, but they were open to facilitating a discussion. And so, seventh grade, Mr. Howe was my sort of social studies science teacher, and we had the like instead of doing our social science classes, he's like, we're just going to talk. Like, if you're feeling something and you want to share it, or if you have questions, let's now's the time to ask. And it was the first time any teacher had allowed that kind of conversation before. Because in the hallways, it was students like trading rumors or theories or I do you know anyone there? Like my cousin goes there, my best friend goes there. Like, did they make it out? What have you heard? Um, but
Can you
the
remember any of the rumors or theories that were circulating like right in that time? Like what would a middle schooler be able to know? Because again, like there wouldn't be an internet forum, there wouldn't be a Reddit chat that you're in, there wasn't a Discord group about any of this. So it was the coconut telegram.
absolutely.
It's the only way that you're getting information on this.
So I can't remember the how long it was after, but I remember a very popular rumor was around the trench coat mafia, which is this thing that was sort of retroactively applied to Eric and Dylan, the shooters. That there was like a super secret, not exclusive, but like a uh, a really violent club, or they just called it the trench coat mafia, and it was about nerds getting bullied, and they were exacting revenge. and it was associated with like goth culture, and you couldn't wear like a trench coat, or wearing a trench coat became very like uh, frowned upon, and had a lot of social weight.
At the same time, that probably the most famous trench coat movie of all time
Absolutely.
comes out. You know, I think back to like the fall after Columbine at my high school, that there were the kids that dressed just like extras from the Matrix.
Absolutely.
And you had this confluence of these different social factors around Eminem and Insane Clown Posse and Marilyn Manson and the Matrix, that there was there was some coolness at the same time associated with that. So I think that that's an interesting juxtaposition, that we had this kind of iconic look in pop culture at the same time that there were these, now we know, false rumors
Absolutely.
of this trench coat mafia, even though the trench coat in and of itself has been a symbol in school shootings back to the 1980s,
Hmm.
when the first trench coat related school shooting was a kid who walked to the front of his English class, and he pulled a gun out of his trench coat and shot the teacher in the head in front of the class.
Yeah.
And so there has been some imagery and ideology around the trench coat. But again, Columbine was not the root or the start of that.
No, but like when I saw The Matrix, I remember there was like a almost a band boycott, like don't go see The Matrix. That like is what caused Columbine somehow. It was the coolest thing I had ever seen. So like I felt very conflicted because like I really liked the aesthetics of the movie, and it was
And
incredibly
it's
cool.
this very, very powerful story about
Yeah,
trans identity, and
absolutely.
going through this gender transformation and this role transformation and having a new world open up, which ironically couldn't be further from a lot of the rhetoric around school shootings now.
Absolutely. I it was very strange for like the aesthetics of Columbine to be the center of conversation, because I don't know why, but I think it maybe felt easier to talk about or to latch on to. Well, they looked like this, and therefore let's focus on what they looked like rather than anything else. And I think it goes to the desire to want to explain why it's happening, which, yeah, I get it. Like when something violent happens where people die, our immediate impulse is to try to figure out why. And I think it functions for a few reasons, that impulse, but one of the reasons is because I think if we understand why something happened, we'll be able to do differently or to respond differently, and it's a way to keep us safe or make us feel safer, if we know why something happened. And so if Columbine happened because of this sort of goth culture or trench coats or alternative whatever, like you listen to the wrong music or you listen to
Well, there's
uh,
an interesting phenomenon that I've noticed of othering.
oh yeah.
And if you make the school shooter different from who
Yes.
you are, then that's somehow protecting me.
Yes.
I'm My kids are not the goth kids. My kids are not listening to Eminem and Marilyn Manson. It's only the monster that listens to that. And
Mhm.
as long as we put all of those other forces further away, then it absolves us from the personal responsibility of having anything to do with this. But so kind of in those days and weeks after the shooting, as more information starts to come out, like what's the reaction in the community? Like when do people start to um, kind of explain and rationalize what
Mhm.
happened?
Pretty soon. So in the community, like there's different circles that I was in. I was not, because I didn't go to the same school, um, and I lived a little bit away. I'm probably about a mile, maybe a little mile and a half. The chain of information is slightly different, but my sister would drive me, and sometimes my parents would go too. There was this memorial set up at Clement Park, and Clement Park sort of borders Columbine. So, and the police had roped off pretty far all around the school, so you couldn't get close. Like they was still investigating like explosives, whether or not they had found everything. And so no one was allowed in, but that was the closest you could get. And there were these walls and memorials that people had set up and would walk around and, leave flowers or bears and sort of gather and mourn communally. And so I think like Rachel Scott's car, she was one of the victims. She had parked there. And so like everyone was leaving things on her car. But I had started to notice that it went from like memorializing and grieving to like almost an evangelical like recruiting, where churches would come and like pastors would get up on like a box that they brought and start giving like sermons. And it wasn't always evangelical. Some like choirs would come and sing songs that were pretty benign, that didn't have like an agenda. But I definitely remember like flyers and pamphlets for like youth groups or churches locally that are like, this is really hard to process and you should come to the church and we can help give, love and support our community. And at the time I was like, cool, this is great. Cause like I was raised in a white evangelical, relatively fundamentalist conservative group. And so that made sense to me that like, this is, a time for churches to step in. But there was some new elements for me. So in the church and circle that I was a part of, there was this belief that this thing called spiritual warfare exists. So it's not just like God and the devil, but there's like angels and demons, and like they're like personified. If you ever read like the Screwtape Letters or any of the other like pop Christian, like This Present Darkness, like they believe that there were demons and angels operating in the world that were influencing human events. And I heard so many people talk about how the shooters were actually being controlled by demons or influenced by demons, and that the people that were saved were protected by angels or Jesus. And there was this martyrdom narrative that started entering the conversation, specifically around Rachel Scott and Cassie Bernal. And like there's books about this. Like you can go to like a Christian bookstore today and find multiple books that, like, She Said Yes, I think is one. I can't remember some of the names of the others, but it was this story that like the shooters would say, do you believe in God? And I think maybe Rachel said yes, and then he shot her. And so Christians latched onto that real hard, real quick. They're like, this is about good versus evil. This is about the devil versus God. And these students are martyrs. And like also in pop Christian culture, martyrdom became a really weird topic of fascination. So like, I don't know if you know this world at all, but there was this band DC Talk, which was the coolest Christian band that had ever Christian banded. And they put out like the song and disc called Jesus Freak, and they made a book called Jesus Freak about martyrdom around the world, and specifically Christian martyrdom. And it ties into this narrative of Christian embattlement and persecution still in the US. Like they framed it globally, but like that's a really popular Christian nationalist narrative of persecution. And so Columbine fed right into that. And it was almost like grounds or premise for revival, or that Christians were going to respond, and it was going to be like God would use Columbine to do something incredible in the community.
And to just
yeah.
pause there for a minute so the audience knows, we'll actually be getting much more into this topic. I have an upcoming episode with a PhD Jesuit reverend, and we are going to talk in depth about the monster narrative and the way that Western literature has created monsters and others through rituals of violence and dealing with violence and dealing with the protection of men and women. So it sounds like you experienced that exact narrative play out, because there always needs to be separation that absolves society from responsibility around any one of these unspeakable acts that we talk about for hours.
So there's this that's first element. There's a second element of monster narratives. I like that framing. I think that's helpful. I started to hear, not only was it um, these sort of spiritual entities, agents acting, it was Columbine was a reaction to like godlessness or the lack of prayer in school or the fact that the US had abortion or gay marriage. So the Christian community that I was in started tying anything that had to do with Columbine as a direct result of things they didn't like in the world. And so I grew up watching like the 700 Club, and I remember, you know, constantly, like, if there was a hurricane, it was because gay people in New Orleans. That was like this narrative that was just a normal thing to say out loud on purpose. And people did that with Columbine a lot. And so, but then I started seeing other people outside of my circle say, it's not Marilyn Manson, it's not abortion, it's actually guns. And the NRA was going to have a convention in Denver just like really soon after, just like I want to say a week later. It was the same month at least. And so I have these competing narratives being told to me by adults that I trust, that it's demons and abortion and prayer in schools and guns and Marilyn Manson and ICP. And I don't like, they all felt at that point in my developmental stage that like possible explanations. Like, I'm sure that maybe it's guns, maybe it's ICP. I didn't have the critical thinking or analytical ability to parse out why one might be more true than the other. But I remember generally feeling suspicious of the music one, feeling very suspicious of the Matrix one, also because the Matrix was incredibly cool. But it wasn't because I like, was smart. I just thought I liked it. And I don't think I was ever given deeper, better explanations for why Columbine happened beyond that from adults.
Well, I mean, that fits the monster story that goes back to Frankenstein, in the early 1800s, but even into biblical literature, within the Bible, the monster story has four parts. And the first is that the monster has to come from a distant place, and usually a culturally distant place. And that's where you can you can blame the fringe. So Marilyn Manson, the goth culture, the trenchcoat mafia, the people that hang out in the basement, those are all those culturally distant people. And then the monster needs to attack something that culture privileges. And so in this case, a school, education, children, women, those are all the things that we place all of this privilege on in culture. But where you see a lot of this kind of evangelical energy around, well, we need more church, we need more structure, we need to make sure kids are protected from all of these cultural dangers, is that the monster needs to die for your cultural stability to be restored. So we can't get back to the way that things were until that other is kind of washed away from our society. But then I think the most interesting part of that in all these narratives is that the death of the monster can't be my fault. The actions of the monster can't be my fault. That I am an observer to this. I'm a victim of this. That even though so many things we've learned about school shooters, they come from the community. They have been failed by society. They've been missed by social services. They've been overlooked in the education system. They've been bullied by peers. We need to absolve ourselves from any of that responsibility in the monster story, because it's the work of the other. It's the work of the nameless, faceless monster who we can never talk about their unspeakable violence, even though we're going to keep talking about it forever and ever and ever.
So as you were talking, I was thinking about like monsters and when was I the most afraid? And it's funny is that I was the most afraid around the people that were trying to protect me. And so specifically, the first weeks that I would go back to school, we had never had like police beyond like a dare officer, and like I had Officer Bob in 5th grade. Officer Bob was like super nice. He always had stickers. Like I graduated from the program. I thought it was like the best thing ever. But now the police had assault weapons. Like they had full rifles, they had tactical gear, they had dogs, and now there were chains on doors. So they went to single entrance. Like that's a really common reaction, and we're still in that reaction. That anytime that there is a threat or fear of violence at a school, we involve more police. And the chains on the door, I remember, were like really thick and heavy, and they had giant padlocks, and they had like, police at all the entrances, and they made me more afraid than anything I had experienced, either watching on TV or going to the memorial or like any conversation. I was scared of all the guns that were now in my school in response to guns being in school. And I know that they were trying to keep us safe. Like I believe every adult in my life was trying their best. That they were also scared. And every explanation that was given to me, even the weirdest, most insane explanations that I now like reject as an adult, like I believe those people were trying their best too. But
And that aligns with a number of different surveys that have been done over the
yeah,
last few years about student, parent, and staff perceptions around different fortifications of campuses. That when students are surveyed, they feel less safe when they're at
absolutely.
schools with metal detectors and police officers. I had a guest on the podcast a couple episodes ago who's a principal at a school in rural Missouri, and he wrote his dissertation on perceptions of armed staff on campus.
Yeah.
And in his survey results, staff actually feel less safe at a school where there are other staff members who carry weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And parents overall. There was a survey that I did last year around perceptions of security and safety at schools. And it was the schools that had visible fortification, that had secure entry, that have officers on campus. Those parents had a worse perception of school safety than the parents at schools without those elements.
Absolutely.
So
And
it's
that
kind of
makes sense.
paradoxical.
Yeah, it the more visible signs of security that you see, you make an assumption that you're in a more dangerous environment.
I remember being terrified at the airport for the first time after 9/11.
Yes,
Like the
absolutely.
National Guard is there, there are Humvees with
Yep.
guys on 50 cal machine guns. It's like I think I walked through the airport like with my hands up the whole time.
Yeah. I think that's natural. Like 9/11 had that same impact, is that, we want to make something safer. So we introduce things that on impulse make you think it's going to be safer, but experientially make everyone feel less safe. And that just like, okay, I want to parse the difference between the perception of safety and the actuality of safety. Like, I don't think that the added police in my school made me less safe, but I definitely perceived a greater threat. I had more fear. And like, I do think that there's evidence to show that having police in school increases certain risks, and especially arming staff. Like that's a terrible idea. Do not arm staff in schools. That will actually like decrease safety. But I I think it's important to at least acknowledge that even if something isn't less safe, the experience and anxiety of students and staff is just as important as their actual safety. And it's making schools feel worse, and it's harder to learn, it's harder to work in those environments. And like teachers are criminally underpaid anyway, so like adding more responsibilities that make their job harder, make students more scared. It's a really horrible reaction and difficult position to put teachers into and to put students into. I have a kid now, so like she's 11 years old. She now attends Euclid Middle School, which is very bizarre for me. Like as a parent, like I used to, wait on the steps for my mom to pull up, and now I'm the adult pulling up and the kid, or to pick up all the kids. And she started doing lockdown drills in the fourth grade, maybe third grade. And I had never gone through a lockdown drill. Like, have you actually?
I
Like,
did.
as a
I
student?
actually, yeah. And I mean, I went through a 3 week shooting when I was in high school in the DC area, as there was a serial sniper uh, in the DC area who was shooting random people all over, including a middle school student in the neighboring school district. He was getting out of his car to go into the school, and he got shot.
I
So
remember
there were
this.
these two guys driving around in a car, and they were just firing at random people. So
Yeah.
for those 3 weeks, all outdoor activities were canceled. There was construction paper over all of the windows of the school. There were tarps that were hung up by the bus turnaround. A lot of parents kept their kids home, and
Mm-hmm.
people didn't leave the house. When we did leave the school, we'd leave in small groups, and you'd run to the bus, or you'd run, in a zigzag to the parking lot. There was
What?
a genuine fear that you were just going to be shot, because the people that were shot were pumping gas at Home Depot, walking across a parking lot,
Yeah.
and it was completely random. Yeah, so I experienced that as a high school kid. So we
Well,
did real life lockdown for
yeah, that's not a prep lockdown. That's a lockdown.
yeah.
Like, you
And
went.
we never did. Yeah, there were never unannounced drills or kind
Okay,
of procedures within the school
man,
that were
I'm
ever
so
rehearsed
sorry.
in the way that they are now. That really came out of it's around 2008 when
Yep.
really the rhetoric around lockdown and active shooter started, with some materials that the Department of Homeland Security put together, and
Hmm.
then it was really Sandy Hook that spurred the lockdown, as being something that was institutionalized across every school in the country, even though in Sandy Hook it certainly didn't help the kids there to be
Oh no.
locked down in any way, shape, or form.
Um, I I missed all lockdowns. Like, even though we were both in school and had shootings nearby, we didn't have programs to go through because they weren't around yet. But now students today are going through those programs, and I remember, I didn't want to give her more information that was not helpful, and I wanted to talk with her about, like, in an age appropriate level, what are you experiencing, and what are they telling you. And I think that they had framed it as kind of like a fire drill, like we practice things to make sure that we can do, leave the building safely, or if we need to stay in the room safely. And I think they told a story about, like, a bobcat had gotten into a school one time, and they in a more rural part of Colorado, and so they wanted to make sure that students could practice. And so she's like, "Oh yeah, in case like wild creatures get in, sure." And I was like, I'm gonna fourth grade. We're gonna let that one. Sure, it is bobcat preparedness. Um, and then later it was more about, like, if someone that's not safe comes in, was I think around fifth grade maybe. And then for sixth grade, right after Appalachia High School, there were hundreds, probably thousands of threats nationally. I don't actually know the number. Do you know? Does
Nobody
anyone
knows, because unfortunately
know?
that's information that's not collected in
Oh, okay.
any concernable way.
Okay, so any government agencies listening right now, there's a huge need for more data collection and things like this. I would love to have a national database for things like what you're doing, but also just threat reports. But Euclid Middle School got one, and a lot of, like, our little public schools in general. So but at the district level, but at the school level, there were threats, and so the school contacted all the parents, through an email, and said, "Hey, we take all threats to our school very seriously. We've investigated this threat and found it not credible. However, out of an abundance of caution, on the day that it was specified, it was like a Thursday. They're like, on Thursday, we're going to have some additional police presence, and um, just going to give you a heads up." And I talked with her mom, and I, thought, does this information help her? Like, knowing that there's a threat? Like, probably not. Would she change anything? No. I didn't realize that the additional police presence was going to be like a lot of police, like very visible, noticeable. I thought they were going to have like someone that, like, parked outside. And so when she shows up to school, there's cops everywhere. There's guns out. There's dogs. There's a lot going on. And so she doesn't have any more information than any of the other kids that weren't told anything. But some parents did tell their kids that there was a threat. But their children, the messages get a little bit garbled. And so on TikTok and Snapchat, specifically the ones were mentioned by the school, of like students are sharing lots of information, and a lot of it's not true. And so we started to try to communicate a little bit to students that like there was a threat. There's no indication that anyone is unsafe, but that's why we have extra police. And so when I picked her up, she's like, this was a really stressful day. This was hard. And I was like, oh, fuck. Oh, I'm so sorry. Like that. It was a really emotional moment for me, and hard to process that like she had experienced a threat of gun violence at a school where I was around her age, hearing about gun violence in schools for the first time, and that things haven't gotten better. They've gotten way worse. And I have very few tools, if any, to help her process or understand. I mean, I can give her at least less of the narratives that were given to me. But like at this point, like I'm doing a PhD on school shootings. Like I am in the weeds in this issue, and I am better prepared than anybody at the school to try to explain why this is happening. And I'm still like, I don't know I have nothing to offer you that can make what you're feeling that much better right now. Mostly what I can do is listen and sit with you and ask questions and be supportive and maybe offer a little bit of information, but mostly just say, I'm so sorry. Like, you shouldn't have to deal with this. This shouldn't be what your 6th grade experience is. And I love you, and I'm sorry. And that felt really hard.
If there was another threat, or if you could go back to that day, would you keep your daughter home?
No, I don't think I would. Like if she, so this is a per kid decision. I think that some kids that maybe have higher anxiety, if that's something that is going to be stressful or damaging for them, sure. For my kid, no. So statistically, like school's one of the safest places she can be. And I know that. And that's a hard thing to frame when we talk about school shootings. And I've said this online, and people are like, the hell they are. No, you're going to get shot if you go to school. Because there's like this inflated perception of how common it is because of media coverage. Like we sort of associate frequency with a coverage amount.
Well, it's a sacred space too.
Yeah.
That a school is different from any other part of the country because a parent gives the government custody of their child,
Mm-hmm.
and a parent trusts that the government is going to deliver their child back to them safely at the end of the day. And that's a promise that's broken at schools all over the country. And I think that it gets down to the numbers don't really matter, because if there's just one kid who is supposed to come home safely and they get murdered at their school, then that's a failure of trust in this entire system. I mean,
Absolutely.
I've talked about this over and over, but there were fatal airplane crashes every single year from the 1940s until the 2000s. And then people said, we've had enough. And the government and industry came together and came up with a plan to have 0 fatal airline crashes. And now it's been 20 years and nobody's been killed on an airliner. Like, it's not that things are impossible. And it's not that it was even dangerous back then. I mean, even in the 90s, when there's one crash a year, there are millions of people that flew safely. So you say, oh, well, roll the dice. There's a pretty good chance it's not going to be your plane. But that's not a mentality that we as adults accept. We don't accept that we might die from like a highly preventable death. Like we demand that something is done to prevent that. And I think that's what's so difficult about school shootings is who is going to be that one parent who has to deal with the broken promise.
Mm-hmm.
And when that parent could be you, then everything is scary because it could be any day. Until it's zero, it could be any day.
I think you're right. That is not how I experience it. I think a lot of people do experience it exactly like what you're saying. And some of that's probably just because I've spent time reading about it. And when I try to contextualize like the frequency of like how many students have died this year, like it's 300 maybe. Is that
This
ballpark?
year? Oh,
Yeah.
much lower, much lower. Yeah, there have been.
Oh, sorry, two, 300 shootings.
Yeah, 200 or 300 shootings. Yeah,
Okay,
and
so
most of them are not fatal.
okay, so 100.
I'm gonna pull it up right here because any of this information that you're ever looking for is on k12ssdb.org. So yeah, this year 210 people have been killed or wounded
Okay,
at a school.
so nationally, 210 students have died.
Not
My,
died, just shot, and those
okay,
include
so it's less than that. Okay,
yeah,
so
those include community members, people
yeah,
who are at the schools for football games, parents, teachers, staff members, relatives,
yeah,
so on. So, I mean, yes, extraordinarily statistically rare. 60 million kids are at 130,000 different school campuses.
exactly.
Very, very, very statistically rare, but not zero. And I think this is a topic that we need to demand that it's zero because there are paths to get there. It
Mm-hmm.
just takes social will to demand that.
So I am probably more afraid of gun violence broadly versus school shootings, and I think it's important to contextualize like school shootings are a particular kind of gun violence that is very rare when in the scope of gun violence. It's like around 1% of gun violence is like a school mass shooting. And I like one of the way you defined a school shooting in the most broad terms, which in the literature, I think does a terrible job. And when I say the literature, I mean like when scholars try to talk about school shootings, what counts as a school shooting, and most of the numbers I think underreport because of the way that they define. So I think your approach and a broad definition is the way to go.
I mean, to
But
take that to another place, imagine if you were trying to define supermarket shootings, which are actually
yeah,
pretty rare. And you said, well, it's only a supermarket shooting if it's an employee of the supermarket and they kill at least 6 people. And you'd be
mm-hmm.
like, well, that's kind of weird because what
That's a
happens
weird
what
criteria.
happens when one person's shot at the supermarket? I mean,
Doesn't count. Yeah.
that's a supermarket shooting. Or what about when I'm standing at the deli counter
Mm-hmm.
and the glass all explodes and a dozen shots were fired, but they didn't hit anyone? Like, oh, that wasn't a supermarket shooting. Go ahead and wipe your hands of that. So I think that again, it's back to this imagery that's created around the school being a
Mm-hmm.
safe space that we need to define this cultural phenomenon of when targeted violence happens there. But you are completely right that what happens at schools is not different from what happens in communities,
Mm-hmm.
and targeted violence at schools is similar to the targeted violence that happens in churches and workplaces and
Mm-hmm.
public places all over the country as well.
And even though, like, I'd say a roughly half of injuries and fatalities from gun violence are self-inflicted. And so, well, even like, as I know that gun violence is one of the top causes of death for children, and it was pretty recently in the last year or two that became the top. And so, I think that often gets conflated. That it's because of school shootings that mentally people are aware of that particular kind because of popular culture, and so it goes into this inflated sense of risk of sending your child to school. So in that sense, doing more research and understanding in the scope of all gun violence that happens in the United States, including self-inflicted, the risk of my child sending my child to school is very low. And so even if there was a threat, that's when I can confidently say, even with a threat, I would still feel comfortable sending my kid to school. Is important because I think it helps parents and hopefully students lower their anxiety a little bit, because being afraid to go anywhere sucks, but especially a place that you are legally obligated to go to. Let's make sure that we're understanding what the risk actually is, and it's low. Secondly, public education is getting beat to hell already, because I think education is used as sort of like a cultural proxy war. At any time that we're having political debates around social issues that are controversial, or at least that are polarizing, it happens in education a lot. So it's trans students and having access to bathrooms. It is trans students playing sports. It is mandated masking for a response to COVID. It is racial integration after Brown v. Board. Like, schools are often sites of cultural proxy wars, and I feel like because of that, there's always a risk of defunding, or an argument for defunding, or an argument for more government and intervention, or more freedom to do charter schools. And so I think when I say that I am not afraid to send my kid to school, part of it is knowing that there's so many people arguing to defund, to close, to overregulate schools, that I am trying to push back against that, to make sure that, like, because I strongly believe in public schools. I think they are vital for not only just the US, like public education around the world, like, is one of the things that I think is the most helpful.
It's been one of the most important things in developing societies throughout history, is having robust public education, kids learning history, learning about society, learning sciences, because your parents are not qualified to teach you most of these things. And I think, just because you brought up the statistical rarity of kids being shot at school, the most dangerous place statistically for a kid is to be in a house that has an unsecured firearm. Correct. And so for a parent who decides that they're going to homeschool their kid because they don't like the values or lessons or facts that are being taught at school, if they're also a parent who has an unsecured firearm in their house, they're actually bringing their child every day into the most dangerous place for that kid, because the most likely outcome of having an unsecured weapon in your house is either an accidental shooting of a family member. Usually children under 4 are the most likely to accidentally play with a gun and shoot themselves or a sibling, a suicide, or an intimate partner who's shot during a domestic dispute. All of those things are many times more likely than a school shooting.
I think that is an incredible point, and I have not heard that said or read that anywhere in a public conversation, and I think that we need to say that more. I also want to reframe school safety more broadly, that it's not just about guns. So when I think about safety, like, to me, feeling safe is not just that I'm not being shot. Like, there's a lot of other criteria when I think about being safe. And I think for a lot of kids, school is one of the most reliable places that you can eat. If you're food insecure, and there's a lot of children that are food insecure, going to school and having access to like a breakfast and a lunch that's like relatively nutritious comparatively to maybe what they don't have elsewhere, where they have access to adults that can help them out of an abusive situation, where they have access to healthcare in a way that they wouldn't otherwise if they're sick, and there's like, they can go to the nurse's office. Schools not only provide, hopefully no one's going to have gun violence in their experience throughout a K-12 education, but they will have access to other things that make them safer as a human being. Maybe that's the first time they encounter mental health care that can say, like, hey, I've noticed you're really struggling with this feeling. Maybe you want to talk about it. And that can be a pipeline into conversations about um, mental illness if they are experiencing that, or if they need support systems, that social or emotional support systems, because of a lot of things that are going on and maybe at home. So I think school safety, it needs to be contextually broader to include everything that a child can experience there. That if we just say schools are dangerous, don't send, like we're really like cutting off some resources to some pretty vulnerable kids.
Well, we also need to remember when evaluating school safety that you're not just evaluating the impact of something on a school shooting,
Mm,
because I think that is a point that is getting lost in all of this. Is why before the kind of current stance on physical security at schools, why did most classroom doors not have a lock? Why
mm-hmm.
did most classroom doors have a window? And that's because at a place where there are children and adults, you usually don't want to have a locked private space.
Yep.
If this is absolutely horrific for all the parents out there, but if you Google school resource officer and rape or school resource officer and sexual abuse, you will see, because I see it in the Google alerts, that there are people who are authority figures and teachers as well who sexually assault students.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a windowless classroom door that locks from the inside, you're creating a completely private space that a student is trapped in a place where they have no agency.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond being victimized by an adult, there's physical abuse and bullying in schools. Every time you have a locked door without windows, that's a place where a student can be beaten, victimized, raped. That's a place where students can do drugs or vape. There's a reason why we don't have locked doors and there are windows into every classroom, because you want all of the parts of school to be a constantly visible, constantly
Mm-hmm.
accessible space, because that reduces the chance of somebody being victimized.
You made this point when we were speaking last time around accessibility, that some of the solutions, using air quotes here, around school safety or in response to like an active shooter, leave students with disabilities without a way to leave. So, like if you're
Well,
in a
yeah.
wheelchair,
I mean, students with disabilities also have the least amount of agency.
yeah,
They get forgotten. They get relegated. They have to ride a different school bus. They have to go to the special classrooms. Uh, but they're, by estimates, about 10% of all students in K through 12 schools have some sort of physical disability in terms of low vision, wheelchair, walker, whatever else. And if you have a classroom that has a drop bar, if you have automatic doors that swing closed in the hallways, you're not able to get through those. If
mm-hmm.
you're in a wheelchair, you're not able to reach the bar. If you're blind, you become disoriented because you can't find your way if you keep running into a closed door. That is a terrifying reality for a really marginalized and forgotten group. That 10% of students is 6 million kids
Yeah,
who are terrified because they either can't get to a safe space or can't get out of the school once it goes into lockdown. Run, hide, fight. The kids can't run, they can't hide, they can't fight. If they can't do any of those things, we need to stop and make sure that there's no danger that's ever going to come to them.
yeah. Not only do I hate that program in general, I've gone through run hide fight trainings. I used to work at a university and we had them
Which
a
we
lot.
should note, there's no empirical evidence behind any of it. A
No, no.
production company was hired on a Homeland Security grant by the city of Houston to come up with a slogan for a public service campaign, and that's what some people at a production studio came up with, and it became institutionalized, and now people are taught to run, hide, fight everywhere.
I can't believe that's true. Oh man, I hate that fact. I liked not knowing that. But I
Run,
think
hide, fight is actually a registered trademark of the city of Houston.
okay, we're gonna skip over that because I dislike it so much. But I think that it's not every solution, but I think a lot of solutions or products that are offered, either like a process, a training, a technique, a technology that is introduced into K-12 education or education in general that is meant to keep people safe, often has a feature that it actually makes things worse or does not improve.
Called the law of unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And there's no burden of proof on these manufacturers or vendors or companies that are trying to make these products. And I am less sure here, but I am going to try to believe that everyone in the space is acting with good intention, that they are actually trying. And I think a lot of them are. There's probably some grifters in there that are just trying to make money, but I think the majority of people that are making products in this space believe that they're helping. But there isn't like it's not like making a new drug for a disease where you have to prove with rigorous standards and testing that it's both safe and effective. People can come to market with any products and say that this will, it is safe and effective, but have no evidence to back it up. And schools can spend a lot of money, and in some cases are required to spend money because of state laws on implementing these things. And it can either just not work, which, okay, but the ones that I dislike the most are the ones that actually just make everyone more afraid. And so I want people to be really careful, especially if you are like in charge of purchasing for a school district, or if you're like a board of education, or especially if you're a lawmaker and you're trying to legislate on this issue, like mandating that schools, adopt this kind of technology or do this program, and it's tied to particular vendors. Like that's
But
that's
when
not
we,
helping.
yeah, and when we don't understand the eventual consequences of things, what the danger is that once they reach critical mass and become institutionalized, you're stuck with them, whether they're good or bad.
Yeah.
And I think in across the whole world, people generally have good intentions when they start something. I mean, when Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook, he wanted a website that would help people meet their classmates. And 20 years later, there are actually a lot of really negative consequences of everything that was built into. Just because he had pure intentions at the start doesn't absolve somebody from all of the harms that inadvertently come out of something once it has mass adoption and widespread use. And I think that that's whoever thought up the idea of run, hide, fight, whoever thought up the idea of a school lockdown, they didn't have any evidence to base it on, but they had an idea, and they were pure in their heart when they had that idea. But 20 years later, school shootings have become more frequent and more deadly. So unfortunately, that well-intentioned idea just didn't work very well. And so what we need to do at some point is strip away some of these institutionalized pieces that are probably more harmful than they are helpful.
Mm-hmm.
For the last couple minutes that we have here, so you're getting ready to start working on your dissertation about school shootings. You've been studying school shootings. What is the biggest takeaway that you would want to give to everyone who's listening today? Because we've talked about your early childhood, your experience in Columbine, the way that the community responded to that, its outsized impact on perceptions of school shootings and school security across the country, and then now your feelings as a father having your daughter attending the same school that you attended. What takeaway do you want a parent or a school administrator or a school police officer who's listening to this to have?
It would probably depend on who you are. So if I'm talking to someone who's a gun owner, I would say the absolute best thing that you can do right now that is pretty cheap and very easy is to make sure that your firearms are stored safely. That if you own firearms in the home, safe storage is absolutely the best thing I could recommend for you to keep yourself safe and to keep everyone else safe. So if you're not a gun owner, you probably know a few. And I think having conversations about firearms is a really healthy, good thing to do. And it doesn't have to be charged. It doesn't have to be heated. It doesn't have to be moralizing. But very practically, safe gun storage is, I think, the most effective way to reduce harm across the board. If you are a parent, I would say that schools are the safest place you can send your kids. And I would encourage you to send your kids to public school 100%. If you are a lawmaker, I would say follow the evidence and be like very suspicious. Like if there's not evidence that's produced that's like a peer-reviewed third-party objective source, don't legislate on it. Don't buy it. Don't mandate it. Like listen to people that are in the space, like public health researchers, listen to educators, listen to evidence.
And if you're a kid, what would you tell a kid who's in school today, since you have one?
I would say probably two things, maybe three. First, I would say I'm really sorry. Like, I would just apologize. Like, this is fucked. It's hard. This is not their fault, and I'm sorry. Like, just acknowledging and validating that experience is really important, I think. I would also tell them that schools are the safest places that they can be, that they're going to be okay. And that I am like, I love them. I'm rooting for you. If you're listening, like, I'm sorry. I love you. I'm rooting for you. And it's hard.
And the good news in all of this is that even that kid who is disenfranchised, who's angry, who's plotting violence, who's thinking violence is the only answer. I've talked and interviewed on this show with a convicted school shooter, with a kid who almost committed a school shooting, people that investigate school shootings. If that kid hears, I love you, if that kid hears, I care about you, that school shooting will probably never happen. Every one of these attacks is preventable. Every one of these attacks has warning signs. Every single kid who feels traumatized in school doesn't need to. Every one of the things that we do is voluntary. It's all something that we have created, whether it's a legal mandate, whether it's something that is just a procedure in your school. We can make a decision about every single thing in the school security space. And if those decisions aren't working, we don't have to keep making them. The future doesn't have to be like this. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. This is soon to be Dr. Shay Swagger from the University of Colorado in Denver. He's a PhD student in the School of Education, grew up and still lives in Littleton, Colorado. And he is somebody that in the coming years, I think you're going to hear a lot more about his research and advocacy and bringing some sense to school safety. So thank you, Shay.
Thanks so much, David. I appreciate it.